I think it's naive or ideological to assume that the open web can just do away with any form of behavioral targeting. I'm sorry, but when you use my email address, you can hash it as much as you want. I'd rather you use the cookie. When publisher generates high value data and then makes it available via DMP to everyone else, the data is gone. So the first most important thing a publisher can do today is stop the automatic leaking of my data in the ecosystem. And then we can talk about how do we collaborate to ensure everyone can make the most from monetizing their own inventory.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs, and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. We have Dr. Mattia Fosci here today, and he's at the intersection of everything that we usually tackle here. So law, because he's a lawyer and privacy expert, and technology applied to marketing, as he is the founder of Anonymised, an advertising platform that helps publishers understand and monetize their audiences at scale across all browsers and devices using only anonymous data. I very much relate to Mattia's efforts as I share with him the dream to create a better digital media ecosystem where quality content can sustain itself, marketing fraud and waste are minimized, and personal data is protected by design. And I was keen to understand the approach he has chosen to, so to speak, save the internet. Now, as a couple of notes, we will refer to display and video ad inventory prices when we refer to CPMs, so standing for cost per mil or cost per 1,000 impressions. And we'll also mention DMPs, again, so data management platforms as data repositories, to put it this way, that can ingest or, in the AdTech jargon, onboard third-party data to enrich a given audience pool in the open ecosystem. Let's get started. Mattia, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Sergio.
Can you give me a proper intro to the challenges that publishers have today when it comes to monetizing their inventory? We've covered this thing with Alessandro De Sanche in the past in a couple of interviews, but looking at the programmatic space and fraud, the lack of control over first party data, and all of these things that we hear more often these days. But you have a very good understanding of both the law and the challenges in terms of monetizing their inventory. How would you summarize the challenge and the opportunity for publishers today?
Big question. Look, there's obviously a big shift happening now with it's been happening for a while with GDPR, well, even with PECR before, and publishers are in a position where they're relatively the relative market share compared to search and social has been declining for a while, and so I think to an extent they are focusing on what's most important right now, which is to bring revenue next month and next quarter, etc. So when I have conversation with them, and we talk about privacy, that's all good and well, but the key bit is what is the impact on revenue that any identity vendor can have for me. And the answer is there's a lot of identity vendors out there that it can even demonstrate if they're bringing any revenue. But they are perpetuating a dependency on third-party data, which has never really served publishers too well. And so now they are looking at essentially protecting this business model. Many don't even know how much money they are not making, or how much money they are losing on cookieless browsers and cookieless and ID-less operating systems. It's just not quantified. So if you can't quantify a problem, then you don't know how big and how important that problem is. Um, and it's so in the short term, they certainly have an opportunity to monetize 40% odd audiences they are currently undersold. In the medium term, that's where the kind of the social and the search comes into place, because we're looking at an ecosystem within browsers where publishers will be most likely overly dependent on whatever the browser decides to allow. And so, as an advertising destination, as a marketing channel, the open web risks becoming even less attractive than search and social. So it's almost like you're looking at a chess game, and you have, I don't know, Kasparov on one hand and me on the other hand. Kasparov is already thinking five steps ahead, and I'm just thinking about, where do I put my bishop next? And that's unfortunately the way publishers and some of the big tech companies are operating in this moment. The publishers being obviously me in the chess analogy.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Thanks for that analogy. So this has been going on for a while. We've got the open market that is shrinking as share of the overall spend, and the promise that the overall market has today when compared to YouTube, to proprietary environments, to walled gardens, is that there is going to be efficiencies in terms of targeting across different properties. And there's only going to be efficiency if you've got some sort of capability to understand that interests that you measure across the board
Correct.
can be kept. And that is not only losing efficiency across browsers, but it's also challenged in the short term. So everyone has been aiming for identity solutions in order to get as close as they can to a walled garden environment. And let me ask you this: if it was as a hypothesis, if we had a perfect open ecosystem where you had perfect profiles, and I know it's a delicate term, but let's say that we have perfect identity across the board, and that I, as a data subject, as a consumer, I do want to have relevant ads and relevant information, so long as I stay in control of my information, the risks, and so on. But if I participate in that, and everything is really relevant and tied to me, in a perfect scenario, would that look to you better than the walled gardens?
So there are two perspectives, right? Me as a consumer and as a data subject, and also me as a news reader and as a consumer of content on the internet, right? So me as a consumer in general, who is careful about their privacy, I certainly would want and expect more from the open web than what we're having. And the reason why I single out the open web is, if you look at someone, Google or Facebook, etc. Let's just take Google, because everyone talks about Google, right? They know everything about us. They know exactly where we are if we have Google Maps on our phone every single moment, every single day. And then they know they can read our emails. They know our search. They have incredible profiles, right? That level of information, which many would characterize as intrusive data collection, is just not possible anywhere else. No other company has that level of information. So what's the issue with open web, and why am I single that out? It's because we can discuss about whether or not we are giving Google genuine consent over that, but there is a value exchange that we kind of are aware of. In the open web, there is not always a value exchange. The value exchange is that we consume internet content for free, and we need to keep that business model, because otherwise, I'm sorry for all the fan of contextual advertising. I think it's fantastic. I support contextual advertising, but for as long as you have Google that can perform very performant and accurate targeting on their properties, and on the other hand, on the open web, you'll be left with, after all the cookies and identifiers are out, is contextual advertising. There is no business model, because the marketers have indicated, I can't measure it, so I don't know how good it is. If you look at CPMs today, a CPM for contextual advertising is, probably a third or a quarter of a CPM for behavioral advertising. So it is potentially a death sentence for many publishers, right?
I always have the same feeling that everyone keeps pushing for contextual, especially if they're not familiar with the AdTech ecosystem. And the
Mhm.
reality is that advertisers are asking for targeting capabilities, measurement capabilities they cannot receive in contextual. The promise is very vague, but that additional value, as you say, in CPMs that the inventory has when you're able to properly, follow interests and preferences of the audience across the board, that additional value, do you think if Google is decoupled, if demand for search, which is of course very precise, or demand for things like YouTube are decoupled from the open ecosystem, that maybe we're not so hooked on this? Or do you think that we are rightly so hooked on it because it really performs better?
It's very difficult to answer any question on performance, particularly kind of walled garden versus open market, open web performance, because I'm actually I'm actually doubtful that the performance that we see in the open web is genuine. There's just so much evidence of fraud, or yeah, dodgy metrics. Let's put it that way. So it's difficult to say. But what we know about it is that the marketers want it. Does it work? Does profiling work in general sense? Unfortunately, it does. And and if you just relied on contextual, you would have context at work. As a gaming site, very clear for certain endemic campaigns. A news site's probably not clear at all. In fact, only the only clear thing that you get from news, which arguably are, perform a very important function in a democracy, is the only thing that's clear to an advertiser is, I don't want news. Particularly, I don't want war news. I don't want, pandemic news. I don't want to be associated with any of that, right? So uh, I think it's naive or ideological to assume that, the open web can just do away with any form of behavioral targeting. Now, but I wanted to come back to the point I was making earlier.
Please, yeah.
I think the difference between why are people at the moment, or why even I'm kind of shocked with open web versus Google, is the reason is that my data, when I share my data with a publisher, then the publisher doesn't it's not even designed, the system is not designed for the publisher to protect my data. The publisher automatically needs to share that information with hundreds of vendors, so that they can take information about me via an identifier, via trackers that record my engagement with content, product, and services, match it and mix it with other bits of information from everywhere to build my profile. Because the decentralized and fragmented nature of the open web requires all these identifiers, all these bits of data to be interoperable. Now, yes, it's needed, but does it have to work that way? Because it just opens up the door to so much abuse. As a data subject, I don't know ultimately who has control over my information, right? I don't know how long they're keeping it. I don't know whether they are, selling it to third parties, whether it's ending up with, sorry, Chinese or Russian companies or other adversaries. There's no control. If I want to go there and say delete my data, I can't possibly contact 1,000 different vendors and ask this. All the Chapter 3 GDPR rights are completely unenforceable. So the problem really lies in the open market, lies with interoperability and the fact that there is no single point of control. and no true consent to my data being shared with hundreds and hundreds of different companies.
Do you think that perhaps because of lack of enforcement, perhaps because they're publishers and the media always have some sort of favorable treatment, you need them, we need them as a pillar of democracy, and I believe agencies looking at enforcement in France, in Germany, in Spain have been pretty lenient with having pretty soft on publishers. What do you think?
Well, I think they've been pretty soft in general. I don't think they necessarily need to target the publishers. The publishers are, I think, without sounding proud, they're a bit victim of a system where they are data providers to a layer of companies who then do all sorts of things with data, right? So yes, they are data controllers, but they don't really have an alternative. I think the leniency there is um, data protection authorities giving the whole industry time to adjust and adapt, and the industry coming up with replacement for cookies that are worse than the cookie. You know, I'm sorry, but when you use my email address, you can hash it as much as you want. I'd rather you use the cookie. To be very honest with you, I'd rather not be identified potentially as the owner of email address XYZ. And that's just an example, right? So I think the issue is there has been a grace period where the industry has been called upon to innovate. The industry has not innovated in the right direction. The data protection authorities don't want to enforce the law too strictly because, well, because the publishers depend on it, because competitiveness depends on it, and because if they enforce it, they essentially handing the whole internet over to the big tech giants from the US. But the end game, as things stand, is the same because it's not the DPAs who are enforcing privacy, it's the browsers. And the browsers are doing that in a very self serving way. So there's value, and there's absolutely all reasons to say third party cookies need to be turned off today. I mean, it's true because they enable, as we said, thousands of companies to spy upon us, everything we do. But what the browsers have done is that they've equated third party cookies and what I generally call interoperable individual identifiers, which includes any other form of identifier, with all forms of tracking. Because that's the way it's been, right? So they say, well, okay, because there's these identifiers and they are flying around left and right, we think it's not privacy safe. So we're going to stop tracking. All forms of cross domain tracking is stopped. Even first party tracking will be limited. And what is left is just whatever the browser wants to offer us, right? So you have direct or indirect benefits for the companies owning the brand. The direct one is they will come up with some sort of proprietary technology that they will market. So first party sets on Google Ad Manager, right? Or publisher provided ID. They're not selling that technology, but they're selling the product that embeds the technology that replaces part of the cookie functionality. Or it could be indirect by just making some of the open web ecosystem less attractive, so more ad budgets um, migrate to other platform, right? Whether it's YouTube or whether it's the rumored kind of first party advertising network that Apple is building, or whether it's tokenized advertising that Brave, our privacy friend, is now building. Everyone has a vested interest in how we replace this cookie. And by shutting the door to competition, because that's what they're doing, they're basically forcing the market to use their own service. So that's the tricky trade off. And it's a very difficult one. Is you cannot let these tracking technologies run wild and uncontrolled. That's bad for privacy. But if you shut everything off, that's horrible for competition and ultimately horrible for publishers.
The closest thing I've seen to privacy preserving environments that can work across the board, even when they are working with segments and aggregate data and being very well aware of or aiming for non-granular targeting so that there's always a way to preserve
Yeah.
privacy. Even those environments have always a challenge in terms of competition. If you have a blog or a site that is very specific to golf or to runners, then you are putting that extra that additional value, you're giving it away, and a generic site with a larger audience pool is going to benefit from that ability that you had to provide context. So they have the audience, you have the context. If we share the pool, there's always going to be that imbalance. But at the same time, we need them all to get together, to stick together, because you need the volume. Is there a future for that understanding? Or do you think there's a better chance of persuading advertisers that they should do the extra work of curating across the board and go back to the old days with magazine media buying and a more you know media retail operations?
We cannot go back to the old ways. The old ways, you had what, maybe 150 publications per country. Now we have maybe 15,000 or 150,000 per
Yeah,
country.
yeah.
I'm talking about the average kind of European country, right? The US is just multiplied by 50. So no, I think expecting advertisers to do any more work is unrealistic as things stand. They have the easy way out. They make money from social. They make money from search. They make money from channels that are much easier to measure against, much easier to plan against, etc. So I think it's unrealistic. You touched upon a very interesting point, which is publishers always feeling, well, this is my data, and why should another publisher make money with my data? And it's a fair point, which we think we found a solution to. Um, but I think, the fundamental principle is a rising tide lifts all boats. Yeah. So if publishers are prepared to sacrifice a little bit of their unique selling point, unique data, everyone will gain from it, right? So it's the same conversation that banks had before, kind of Experian or Equifax existed. Oh, my data is my data, but then by banding together, the whole sector was able to price risk a lot better and make more money. And it's the same for publishers. However, there are distinctions. So in the current system, when publisher generates high value data and then makes it available via DMP to everyone else, the data is gone, right? So you need to replace it with a system where there is a discrete commercial decision in deciding what data you want to share, what data you want to keep first party, and there's a trade off. So in the system we've created, for instance, we allow publishers to share, kind of by default, IAB category data without all the social demographic. There's nothing sensitive, nothing. We just decided not to go down that direction. So interest and intent data, that's shared automatically at IAB level. But if they have very specific ICPM information, so you're talking about the niche publishers there, right? That they know they spend a long time creating that data, they can keep it for themselves. So the advertiser needs, at that stage, for that level of granularity, can only spend on that publisher. Now, why does this work? Because for big segments, yeah, relatively poorly targeted, not poorly targeted, it's the wrong word, but not to the level of granularity of targeting that some publishers can offer, the advertiser will be looking at reach. They will be looking at their ROI,
Exactly.
right? But there will be certain campaigns where they actually looking specifically for that segment, and they're prepared to pay a lot more, and that budget should be preserved for the publisher that generates the data. It's all possible. You just need to think about the problem in a different way, and you can only do it if the data is not automatically leaked to everyone. So the first most important thing a publisher can do today is stop the automatic leaking of my data in the ecosystem. And then we can talk about how do we collaborate to ensure everyone can make the most from monetizing their own inventory.
How do you solve these challenges that we've seen with unified ID? Um, how do you see this? What's the solution? Which clearly is what you're working on. What's the answer?
So we patented a technology that is able to create a individual identifier which is cross domain only with consent. Yeah, it's stable but not persistent, as in the user can easily delete it, but it's more stable than a cookie. And then what we do is we use this infrastructure to create a cross domain profile, but we keep the data on the consumer device. Right, that's key. We keep as much data as possible. Not everything. For instance, the identifier that connects domains is still it's pseudonymized, but it's still personal data, and we can see it. But we keep as much as possible on the device. What we then do is that within the device, we process that data, we process that user profile turning it into anonymous data. And I know very well that anonymous data is a very, very high bar. The way we anonymize the data is this. Basically, the visual identifier is only an infrastructure that allows us to create a profile. That identifier and that individual profile is never shared, always sits with the user. But the publisher or the advertiser can then essentially use our platform to create a segment. So they set the rules of the segment. I want to find people who are based in London, have an iOS. In the last few weeks have been particularly interested in this topic or looking to buy that product, etc. Extreme granularity. We then send an instruction to a machine learning model that sits on the device with the tag that's implemented. So it's nothing the user has to do. It's basically served from our servers through the website on the user device. And that machine learning looks at the data that sits on the device and decides whether or not that browser belongs to the segment. If it does, an identifier is then surfaced in the local storage and passed on to the SSP. But it's an identifier of the segment itself. So many people. What we also do is we make sure that identifier is anonymized, meaning it has no meaning. It rotates. We add noise. It's temporary, so it expires after a while. And all these measures are meant to make it impossible or uneconomical and impractical for AdTech companies that sit in the middle to try to figure out what that segment identifier meant, right? So to sum up, what we do is we use the user device, yeah, as a almost like a hub and a clean room itself. And we anonymize and we replace the user identifier with a segment identifier, which allows publishers to transact on a PMP, PG, direct basis with the advertiser.
So you are doing some sort of federated learning, I understand, because there's no point, I guess,
Correct.
doing machine learning, dumping it on the client unless there can be some learning. And I guess every now and then you will inform the centralized model. I won't go into that one, but you've got that. And then you've got local storage of those segments. So in a way, it resembles the some pieces of the topics API idea where the segments I keep to myself, and I can even, I guess, as a consumer, a big benefit. There could be a way with some sort of plugin, right, to inspect the segments that I declare as a consumer.
Yeah. So the consumer can access their own data account, looking at the data that sits on the device. It's not the browsing history because we clean the browsing history as we use it. It's just the the,
Cache,
the profile
the
itself,
local
right?
storage. Ah,
Yeah. So you then the consumer can go there and just check, what are my interests or what is anonymized guessed my interest will be, and then it can download that data, edit that data, delete the data, etc. Gone. It's all from one single point of contact.
my problem with the advertising ecosystem now is that on the advertiser side, I do not see much sophistication or appetite for risk or appetite to go against the tide. So, do we need to educate the advertiser, or are you ready to play along with the advertiser as things stand
I
today?
wouldn't presume to educate anyone, to be honest. I think there's a slow movement. I w- I've had good experiences, good and bad, but mostly good experiences with agencies. I'll surprise you. And the reason, and I started having good experiences where I did not sell privacy. So privacy is important to them, but no one's 100% clear what privacy means, right? So because people talk about PII instead of personal data, and every vendor approaches any agency in the world say we're privacy first when they couldn't be farther from it. But what they look at is, right, can I essentially reassure my client that we are taking steps to replace the cookie with something that's better than the cookie? And can I then prove that this is not affecting their ROI? Yeah. And then out of these two priorities, because they still wanted the clients to spend and be happy, etc. Out of those two, some of the most enlightened agencies have created pretty big testing frameworks or at least questionnaires, etc. Now, are they testing enough? Absolutely not. But they're not testing enough partly because there's a disconnect between the strategy people that sit at the center of a big agency and the campaign managers whose only priority is to deliver against the objective of a particular campaign. And so sometimes things get lost, but partly because publishers themselves aren't implementing that many cookie free privacy preserving solutions, right? So sometimes there isn't the right scale or the right audience type for the right
Yeah.
campaign to be matched against, etc. So it's again the chicken and egg. Um, so
Yeah.
the advertisers need to drive this shift. I'm fully convinced they need to, but the ad tech work is not helping them, because it's just wasting everyone's time with fake solutions.
How do we change publishers? How do we wake them up? Do you have any ideas?
Ooh. Um, we need help. It cannot be just the vendors. I think as a vendor, the only thing I can do is just be clear. It's just be honest, which I think in this market is pretty. So one thing I don't do is I don't promise what I can deliver. I don't go there and say we're gonna give you this much, and because then they lose trust. Yeah. So
Yeah.
and this hurts my sales because I can just be like everyone else, promising you're gonna make 50 grand a month more from the next month. No, we're doing things differently, and I want to be different as well. I want to be more transparent. But the most important thing is they need to understand that anything that is basically replicating the cookie and leaking their own data is ultimately not in their interest, and they need to find something, some way of giving the scale and the targeting accuracy and potentially the measurement capability to agencies if they want to secure those budgets without leaking the data. Super, super hard. My only advice to the publisher is do not give up, and then try to develop expertise. If you can't do it on your own, get together, band together with other publishers, get someone to develop some expertise, and look outside of the usual suspects. Because the people who've been selling you services for the past 10, 15 years, they don't have a tech stack or the business incentive to do things differently.
Exactly. I love that. Mattia, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Sergio. My pleasure.
Okay, that's all for today. And you will find some episode notes and links to our social channels on mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.